but it's an ancient tree, ancient species. It's recorded in the book of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and dating back 4,000 years, and in the Old Testament. Solomon calls it the first of trees, and the book of Isaiah says it's the glory of Lebanon. But Solomon was given the right for building of the temple and other works to have as much cedar for all his desire, and he took that to heart, and he felled most of the forests in around Jerusalem and in Levant, and the only major stands of the cedar of Lebanon are now actually in Turkey. And while Gilgamesh and Solomon used them for building, the Egyptians used the cedar and the resin and sawdust to preserve the dead and preserve mummified bodies for safe passage into the afterlife. But it's such a monumental tree that it was highly prized for parks and landscape works, and it was introduced into the UK in 1640-ish and prized by Capability Brown, and you see it in a lot of his landscapes. But how did it come to be planted here? Sorry, that's an old photograph and not very good, but with the clock at the top of the square. And it in the centre of Usk, and it was planted between the houses of two friends. Well, I thought that until I spoke to Gareth last week, and I learned that there were two of them. There was one in the garden of Tyrconnell, which is this one, and one in the garden of Mulberry House, which is next door. So one was in the garden of Mulberry House, which stands immediately to the left of the tree as you look at it from the square. And the other one was in the garden, that was occupied by Daniel Partridge then, and the other one was in the garden of Tyrconnell. I'm sorry about that picture, it's come out very out of focus in the, well, it's not deliberate, but it does disguise the state of the but that wasn't the reason. It's accidentally out of focus and I don't know why. But this was occupied by Alexander Shepherd, and they were both, Daniel Partridge and Alexander Shepherd, next door neighbours. They were both prominent. Oh, I don't need to go there yet. We'll go back to a picture of the tree. The Shepherds, Father Shepherd was a solicitor in Usk and had at least 4 sons. Alexander was a doctor, a surgeon who lived in Tyrconnell. Horace, like his father, was a solicitor and lived in Bridge Street somewhere. And then John was ordained, and he was master of the grammar school at one time. And there was another brother, Henry, who was also a surgeon, and he moved to practice in Raglan. And Daniel Partridge was a solicitor, and practiced, I think, in partnership with Francis MacDonald, who lived at Plasnewydd and was a prominent member of the Roman Catholic community in the town, and gave the site for what was then the new Catholic Church. And these two men had these 2 trees. I thought only one until I spoke to Gareth, and they one which was planted between the 2 houses there. So where did it come from? That's where the story brings in this man, Edward John Trelawney. We have to, in order to explore the history of the tree, we now have to embark on some story of Trelawney. And embarking on his story is quite a feat, because he was born in 1792. Of that we can be reasonably certain. He said that he was born in Cornwall, but like almost everything else about his early life, what he says was wrong. He was almost certainly born in London, and he was certainly baptised in Marylebone. And I think he made up the whole of his early life in his autobiography. And I'm just going to read a quote from one of his biographers. There's been several people who tried to write a biography. They don't all agree, but several people have tried. And this is a quote from David Crane. At some stage, in an obscure and embittered youth, he seems to have taken stock of his early years and found them wanting in every detail, and invented for himself a wilder and more glamorous history of rebellion and adventure, which he successfully maintained in conversation and in print for another 60 years. And so everything we thought we knew about, or were told about, Trelawney is wrong. So yes, he was born in 1792, but not in Cornwall as he claimed. He was sent away to school, and we know he was in school outside Bristol. He hated it. He rebelled against authority and was frequently punished and beaten. And he was eventually expelled for behaviour towards the staff and for setting fire to anything that took his fancy at school. So his father despaired and sent him away to the Navy. Now, at that stage, you couldn't join the Navy till age 13, but he was certainly in the Navy before his 13th birthday, and his father had probably falsified his birthday and lied about his age to get him into the Navy, because the Navy at that time, if you went in as a midshipman at age 13, you would generally progress to be a lieutenant. You couldn't be a lieutenant until your 19th birthday. And so the object was to get in as early as possible. Whatever he does say about his Navy career, sorry, I'm not catching up with the slide. Oh, yes, I am. Yes, that's the next one. Whatever he says about his Navy career, it is possible to check some of this from the Navy records. And one of the first ships he joined just before Trafalgar. He says that he didn't get to Trafalgar because his captain put into somewhere in Cornwall for additional supplies. That's not true, because the dates don't work out. But one of the first ships that they encountered was the Pickle. This is, you probably know the story of Trafalgar, and the Pickle was the vessel that brought news of Trafalgar back to the UK. This is a replica of the Pickle, and that was one of the first encounters they had at sea. And he then went on to join the Colossus, or another, and he served on the Temeraire, which, as you probably know, was a veteran of Trafalgar, and then the Colossus, another Trafalgar veteran. And he was deployed to the Cape of Good Hope in HMS Woolwich, and he sailed to St Helena under the command of Captain Francis Beaufort of the Beaufort scale and so on. So he had an interesting career, but as a midshipman, he initially enjoyed the Navy when he went in, but he became rebellious of the discipline, and he was often punished. And punishment for a midshipman punishment in the Navy was often flogging, but that was a punishment suitable for ordinary sailors, people before the mast. As a midshipman, the usual punishment was banishment to the masthead. And he says that he spent a good deal, and Navy records say that he spent, logs do say that he was punished by sending to the masthead on quite a number of occasions. He did see some action. He was at the assault of Mauritius, and when the French garrison was taken against very light resistance, and he almost certainly, as a midshipman, commanded one of the pulling boats that were used to land troops on Mauritius. Then he took part in the battle for Java, and he was wounded during a land battle there because the naval guns were hauled ashore for the assault on Batavia or Jakarta, and he was wounded in the knee in a land battle there. But after the victory there, he was there was a severe outbreak of cholera, and he was invalided home from cholera, suffering from cholera and the wound to his knee. And at home he was under orders when he recovered to go and join another ship, but he never went. He left the Navy. Quite how, there's no record of his discharge. He may have deserted. He says he deserted, but he left the Navy at age 19, although according to naval records he was 24 at the time and should have been made up to a lieutenant, but he by now exaggerated his age by 5 years. And he never did get promotion beyond midshipman. And then, because he refused to conform, he was never commissioned. And very soon, he was back in London at this time. He met and married. I had written in my notes that he fell in love with, but I think that's probably not accurate. He did marry Caroline Addison. They were married in 1813, but it didn't last. He later wrote that I like this quote, he became a shackled, careworn, and broken-spirited married man of the civilized West. Anyway, he refused to settle down as a married man. He often went away staying with friends. He liked his country sports. He was shooting and leaving Caroline at home in cheap lodgings with their baby. And feeling herself deserted, not unreasonably, she embarked on an affair with another lodger, a Captain Coleman, a real captain now, I mean, not just a midshipman. And their affair was discovered by a maid, and the landlady couldn't tolerate such impropriety in her proper house and gave them notice to leave. So Trelawney sued for divorce. And in 1816, that was a major undertaking. This was before the Matrimonial Causes Act. So Trelawney had first to take an action against Captain Coleman for criminal conversation, as it was called. And that it was a spectacular trial. This is a broadsheet, a penny broadsheet circular that was distributed at the time. And he succeeded. You see, he's Lieutenant Trelawney there. He isn't, he never was. And then he did succeed in that case. He was awarded damages which he never got, but the victory in that case enabled him to pursue the divorce, which meant that he had to apply for a private act of parliament which was received the royal assent in 1819, which several years of battling before he got a divorce. So what now? He was at last free, and there's some mystery about the 4 years after the divorce till we next know of him, but he did in 1820, he turns up in Paris. He goes to join his mother, who has taken his sisters on essentially a predatory trip to find husbands. And she'd taken the girls to Paris, but he only joined them briefly before he then travels on to Geneva to see some other friends, and there he meets Thomas Medwin, a cousin of Shelley's, and Edward Williams, an ex-Indian army officer living with the wife, Jane, who called herself Jane Williams, but she was actually the estranged wife of a fellow officer. But then his father dies, Trelawney's father dies, he's back in London, he gets an inheritance from his father, and he now has independent means, and he hears from Edward Williams, who's travelled on to Pisa, and tells him that he's met with Shelley and Byron. And so Trelawney has this groupie idea of going and joining Shelley and Byron and muscling in on their circle in Pisa. And so he sends his guns and hunting dogs ahead to Pisa and travels on to join them. And he arrives in Pisa shortly after Christmas in the beginning of 1822, and through Edward and Jane Williams he meets Shelley on his first day in town. That's Percy Bysshe Shelley. And within 24 hours of arriving, he was playing billiards with Lord Byron. And he was so keen to introduce himself, he told them and entertained them with these fantastical stories of his youth, possibly inspired by, it's a question what inspired which, but Byron's poem, The Corsair, is in part a mirror of his early life, and whether he took his lead from that or Byron wrote, I don't know. We now go back to the earlier quote that I gave you from David Crane and making up his youth. And that's where this story comes to the fore. He starts by telling the Pisa Circle this fantastic story about he deserted the navy, but not before being commissioned into a rank that he never achieved, fighting almost to the death with a fellow officer, falling in with pirates and joining their band and sailing as a pirate in the Indian Ocean. He met and married a beautiful Eastern girl called Zella, who he says was 14 at the time. And protecting Zella, he fought off an orangutan that attacked her. That doesn't look much like an orangutan, but that's what it's supposed to portray. But then Zella died in a shark attack. They were swimming, she was killed by the shark, and he cremated her before moving on to other adventures. And according to him, he'd spent his time, after leaving the Navy, on a rampage through Malaya. And this story impressed the Pisa Circle so much that they were all taken in by it. And to the extent that Mary Shelley wrote a letter to a friend which I'm going to have to read the note, describing his adventures and saying, he murdered, pillaged, whored and sinned throughout Malaya, all between the ages of 13 and 20. All rubbish. And Byron and Shelley, sorry, another picture of yes, Mary Shelley, who wrote that little passage to a friend. And Byron and Shelley were entirely convinced by the fact that he'd had all this Navy experience and he knew about boats. And this is where we come back to being a little bit relevant in the story. They both, Byron and Shelley, have both been talking about buying boats. And Trelawney encouraged them both in that ambition. And I mean, he'd only been with them a few weeks, but he designed boats for them both. He thought he knew all about boats, and he designed a boat for them both. Byron's was to be a substantial craft with an iron keel. There it is. That's his idea on the left. I think that big spot is meant to be the sun, but Byron's ship, an iron keel and a cabin as high and roomy as possible, with 4 guns, one as large as would be safe to make a devil of a noise, was his instruction. Shelley's was to be small, fast and beautiful, with graceful lines, and to be a thorough varmint at pulling and sailing. And only 3 weeks after arriving in Pisa and meeting Byron and Shelley for the first time, he was writing an order for the construction of both boats to an English contact in Genoa. And within 3 months, the 2 boats had both been built. And Shelley, that's Shelley's boat having been built, the Don Juan, although that in itself was an annoyance, the battle, because Shelley was going to call it the Ariel, and when it was delivered, I'm not sure whether it was Trelawney or Byron, but they painted the name Don Juan on it, so Don Juan it was. But Shelley ordered, when it arrived, Shelley ordered extra topmasts and topsails, because he wanted it to be certain of outpacing Byron's Bolivar, as he called his vessel, when they raced in the Gulf of Spezia. The Bolivar was a much more heavy boat and more of a ship than Shelley's. That's the house that they lived in at Lerici, and it was off there that the boats were moored, and they sailed from there to Livorno, about 40 miles to the south. Edward Williams and Shelley sailed the Don Juan with a young boat boy who'd come from the boat builders in Genoa. And then they planned to return to Lerici here on the, this is the Italian. Livorno is here, and Lerici is there, where they sailed down here to Livorno. Viareggio, which we'll come to again in a moment, is there. So Livorno, I haven't quite got enough of the coast on the map, but so he was going to return a few days later, about a week later, and they did set sail. They were going to be accompanied by Trelawney in the Bolivar, but there was a problem. The authorities in Livorno prevented the Bolivar from sailing because it was an armed vessel, because of the guns on board. And so Trelawney watched Shelley and Edward Williams sailing off into the distance and watched them through his telescope, but that was the last that was seen of them. She was oversailed, she had over-canvassed, and she had, sailing into bad weather. There was another vessel who allegedly, a local vessel, who allegedly saw them and tried to persuade Shelley to reduce sail or even to come on board, so they said afterwards. But there was also a story that they might have, the other ship might have, the local Italian vessel might have run them down. There was also a story that Shelley had tried to procure poison shortly before and might be so depressed he was thinking of committing suicide. But I think there's not much credence given to either of those, and he did. Certainly it was bad weather, and certainly it was the Don Juan was sunk. And it was 10 days after the sinking that Shelley's body was found on the beach. This is a supposed representation of that, but this was midsummer. The storm that had sunk the ship had long since passed. They weren't in winter cloaks. Shelley's body was badly decomposed and he was unrecognisable. So that's a fanciful picture. But his body was recovered, only recognisable by his clothes and a copy of Keats' poetry in his pocket. And Mary wanted the body to be transported to the Protestant cemetery in Rome, to be buried with their son William, who died very young and was buried there, and Keats, was a great friend of Shelley's, was also buried there. She wanted him to be buried in the Protestant cemetery with them. However, they couldn't get consent to move the bodies, and when the bodies, Edward Williams and Shelley, when the bodies were discovered, local officials interred them in quicklime in the sand on the beach, and Trelawney arranged to get a furnace made, and he got authority to go back and cremate to exhume the body and cremate the body on the beach. And this is supposed to be a picture of Trelawney here lighting a fire under the body of Shelley, but again, complete fiction. This is the more famous picture, and this was painted by Fournier. It supposedly shows the funeral pyre here with Trelawney, Hunt, who recently arrived from the UK, and Byron, and a carriage here. All rubbish. Again, there wasn't just a funeral pyre on the beach. Trelawney had had a furnace made, which was used for the cremation. Byron couldn't face the sight of the decomposed body, and swam back out. He swam out to the Bolivar, and Hunt, who'd arrived in a carriage from Lerici, couldn't face it either, and hid in the carriage. They weren't. It was midsummer. They weren't in winter coats, and it was a nice sunny day. Apart from that, there is a bonfire. But that's about all that's correct. And Trelawney said that the body was consumed except for the heart that wouldn't burn. Now, I don't know, but he did pluck something from the ashes and said it was the heart. There are people who say it was more likely to have been the liver, but Mary Shelley didn't mind. It was pickled in brandy, given to Mary eventually, and she kept it as a keepsake for the rest of her life. And is that the next? Yes, there she is with the jar containing the heart. But that meant that we got he cremated the body, got the ashes, and Mary wanted them to go to the Protestant cemetery in Rome. That was the whole reason for the cremation. And so the ashes, Mary didn't take them. She sent them to be buried in the Protestant cemetery. And then Trelawney, some while later, went to visit the cemetery, and he said that he was disgusted that, I've forgotten quite what, he was dismayed to find Shelley's grave was mingled in a heap with 5 or 6 common vagabonds. No such thing. They weren't vagabonds, they were quite distinguished expats in their own right. But Trelawney secured what was, he thought, a much better spot, and arranged for the ashes to be disinterred and reburied in this spot in a corner of the side wall of the cemetery. It's quite an imposing place, the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And this was against the side wall. These are old Roman walls, part of the Roman curtain wall. And Shelley is buried between those 2 trees, and then Trelawney bought the whole plot and reserved himself the plot to the left of Shelley, offered Mary Shelley the plot on the right, which she didn't take up. But after the burial of the ashes here, Trelawney's life took on a new turn. And the following year, he sailed to Greece with Lord Byron. This is Trelawney in his Greek phase. They didn't sail in the Bolivar. I don't know why, but Byron sold the Bolivar, and they chartered a vessel called the Hercules. Byron stayed for some time in Catalonia before going on to Missolonghi, and Trelawney travelled on to the mainland, and in Greece he writes to Byron, which I'll have to read. He said to Byron, "A harem is to be formed on favourable terms, maidenheads as plentiful as blackberries." And he reportedly bought 12 or 15 girls for himself, including a negress, but it didn't last, and the charitable view is that he may have purchased them to give them their freedom. Anyway, he joins this man, Odysseus Androustos, who's a Greek patriot fighting for Greek independence. And then he joins up with his band, and then he hears that Byron has arrived in Missolonghi and travels to see him, but Byron dies in Missolonghi before he gets there. Trelawney takes charge of the arrangements, and the body is sent back to England for burial. Trelawney went back to fighting with Odysseus, and they had a cave on Mount Parnassus. These are two buildings actually in the cave. It's a substantial affair, and there are tales of his exploits fighting from this cave. This actually perhaps needs a bit of explanation because it's not very good. But the cave is here. This is a more modern picture with this structure. It was originally accessed by ladders in Trelawney's time, and this staircase has been constructed so you can now get up to the cave. So I think that's now the cave, but that was the case. Anyway, he joins up with Odysseus back in the cave and fights with him. He marries Odysseus's half-sister. There's some question about her age at the time of the marriage. She later said that she was 13 at the time. She was certainly a child bride. There's an extraordinary story of other expats going out to join them, fighting their battles, and turmoil amongst all the different factions, and an attempt on Trelawney's life when he was wounded badly and had a bullet lodged in his shoulder, which he lived with, and his bride Tzitza gave birth to a baby girl that he called Zella after his first fictional wife. You couldn't make it up. Well, he did make it up. Tzitza nursed him after his wound, but they later fell out. Odysseus was captured, and then he divorced Tzitza and eventually came back to London. I mean, that's cramming a huge story into very little. But he was restless in London. He travelled to America, and lots of adventures in America, including swimming across the Hudson River just below Niagara Falls and almost drowning on the return crossing. And then probably going on to lots of other adventures in the States, and possibly going to Haiti, but I don't know. And then back to London, he meets and embarks on an affair with Augusta Goring, who was married but estranged from her husband. They have a child together, and Harry Goring, this is Augusta, they have a child together, and then Goring gets a divorce and they subsequently marry. And then they move to Usk. They lived first at the Royal, coming back to more familiar tales now. And whilst there, he bought a property called the Cot, which he rebuilt and called the Prospect, and which we now know as Toynbell. But he was not there for many years before he moved to, that's Toynbell, sorry. Not there for many years before he moved to Kevin Island. that's not the house he moved to. That it's been rebuilt since. Well, of course, it's now burned down, but that's what it was before it was burned down. But that's not how it was when. And that's another picture of Kevin Isla, which, as we will see in a minute, has a cedar tree in front of it. And he was a respected farmer at Kevin Isla, but his behaviour soon scandalised the local people. Forgotten where that. Oh, no, we'll come to that for a minute. He was seen working on the Sabbath, would you believe? And he and his family were bathing naked in the river. These things scandalised the local inhabitants. And one girl who was visiting his daughter, he had a daughter, Letitia, who was probably in her early teens then, this visiting girl was rather troubled by the annoyance of her long hair, so he simply cut it off before sending her home to her parents. He thought, and he had some very odd ideas, he thought eating food hot was dangerous, so even if it was cooked, it had to be cold before he ate it. He never wore socks or underwear. They were unnecessary bourgeois pretensions. And he was obviously regarded by most of the locals as a bit of an oddball. And there's the story of one friend of his daughter's who visited for tea on occasion, and when she left to go home, Trelawney would give her a loaded handgun that she was to fire in the air when she got home to say that she was safely home. I've never quite worked out if when he heard a shot, how he worked out that she was safely home and hadn't shot an intruder on the way home, an assailant on the way home, but I don't know. And I've not been able to confirm this story, but some of you will remember Glyn Aston, who was the vicar at Gwenesney, local, and he told me the tale, that part of the story about the girl going home with a handgun is well documented, but Glyn told me that girl was Constance Jones, who became known as E.E. Constance Jones. She certainly was the same age as Letitia, and the Jones family lived at Lankeo House, and it's certainly possible that she was the visitor, and Constance Jones became better known as E.E. Constance Jones, and was the first, a noted academic, and became the first mistress of Girton College. I've tried to confirm that, and I can't find any other stories. I have been in touch with the archivist at Girton College to see if they've got any information about her early life, and they didn't know of that story, and I think I've started a bit of a thing going. But then Trelawney also, I think the end came really when he brought home a young girl who was only known as Miss B to Kevin Isla as his mistress. Unsurprisingly, his wife took objection to that and moved out into Usk, probably only briefly before going to London and then on to the continent. But this is where the story comes back to the cedar tree at long last. He propagated a number of trees at Kevin Isla, and he planted a lot of the arboretum there, including this cedar tree that is at Cefn-Isle. And it is thought, I can't see that he ever claimed this himself, but there are many other stories that say that he propagated these cedar trees from a cone that he collected at the Protestant cemetery in Rome in memory of Shelley. Now, he grew a number of trees from that cone. That's certain that he did do that. They planted at Cefn-Isle to Unbell, and he gave some to his friends. He had a small group of particular friends in Usk who used to meet for tea regularly, and the tea was brewed by Trelawney in his own fashion, I don't know what that was, and served in large bowls, which were probably souvenirs from the cave on Mount Parnassus. And the friends were Master Arthur, as he called him, who was Reverend Arthur Adams Williams, the Vicar of Llanbadach. He also turns up in another local story because he seems to have been the vicar who baptised Alfred Russel Wallace, and Wallace accused him of being an illiterate Welshman who got his name spelt wrong, and that's why he has Russell with only one L. But that's rubbish. Anyway, the Master Arthur, as he was called, the bird, who was Daniel Partridge of Mulberry House, and the doctor, who was Alexander Shepherd of Ticona. Master Arthur was given 4 trees, and they now stand in the churchyard at Llanbadach Church. And Daniel Partridge was given one to plant at Mulberry House, now gone, and the doctor was given the one which is the one that now gives rise to our story. And I've been to the Protestant cemetery in Rome to try and identify the tree that this came from, this cone came from. Now, there is a tree there, but clearly there is a cedar tree in the foreground amongst the others, but clearly that's quite close to the grave, but it's clearly not mature enough to have produced a cone in the time we're talking about. And there are some other trees in the cemetery, but nothing that would have been likely to be the parent. There are other substantial mature trees close by in Rome, but not one that I think obviously produced this fir cone. Anyway, back to this is Shelley's grave in the Protestant cemetery. Cordium, Heart of Hearts, and then a Shakespearean quote from The Tempest. And Trelawney, as I told you, had the grave next door. He reserved that for himself, and he's buried there, right next door to Shelley. And if you can't read that, that's the inscription, which is worth reading out. These are 2 friends whose lives were undivided, so let their memory be, now that they have glided under the grave, let not their bodies be parted, for their 2 hearts in life were single-hearted. He knew in life, he knew Shelley for a little less than 6 months. So that sounds a little pretentious, maybe. And really, that's the end of the story. But just a little coda. In about 1857, I think it was, Trelawney sold up at Cefn, and the sale of farm implements and household effects was a long-remembered local event, and Trelawney was a prominent and a welcoming vendor. He was hosting the event, but he refused to provide free alcohol because he was now a teetotaler. And although happy to provide a top to any of his friends who turned up. And at that sale, Lady Raglan, the then Lady Raglan, bought a chair, which was at Cefn when I did the sale of all the effects at Cefn, and that was always known as Trelawney's chair, which Lady Raglan had apparently bought and subsequently had reupholstered, but we sold it at Christie's then without the provenance of it being Trelawney's chair, with an estimate of £1,500 to £2,500, and I can't remember what it fetched. It was something that I thought I might bid for as a souvenir, but it was out of my budget. And then he moved to London before going to Something, where he died. And before going to Something, he was persuaded to sit as a model for John Everett Millais for a painting to be called the Northwest Passage. And this is a professional model. The girl who's supposed to be his daughter is a professional model, and but Trelawney was persuaded as an old man to sit for that portrait. And he complained bitterly about the painting. Some thought that it was because it was an unflattering portrait, but in fact, it's a pretty true representation. That's a photographic portrait at a similar date, and I think there's little to distinguish between the two. And he wasn't unhappy about the what might have been thought of as an unflattering portrait. What he was upset about was the fact that he was a teetotaler, and now he's shown with a glass of grog. So there we are. End of story.
Right, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was indeed fascinating. I certainly knew nothing about the lives of those people. Just wonder if anybody has any. This will be a real tester. Has anyone any questions?
With his exploits in us, did any of those ever come to court? Any of his exploits? His unusual
I don't
exploits?
think so. I don't think so. No.
Thank you.
Not that I know of. Sorry.
Do we know why he came to us?
Oh, yes, when at the time, there was a time when he was living in Bristol, and he apparently said that he came to us because he travelled through us on some other trip and he liked the look of it. But he was running away from London, and the affair with Augusta Goring had been a bit of a cause célèbre, and they wanted a bit of peace and quiet, and he decided that he was going to buy a country estate, and Cefn was as big a country estate as he could afford, I think, at the time.
Yeah, it was just the other cedar trees in and around us. Would you know anything about the cedar tree in New Market Street?
No, there were two. There was cedar tree in New Market Street and one in the grounds of the Lawns.
Yeah, the lawns, yeah.
And I don't know. And there's one outside the old town hall, the British Legion.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but I don't know that they're related. I don't know that they're not, but only.
But we can never know, can we?
Well, I
But
suppose.
they don't. I mean, honestly, as you described, there are three types of cedar trees. This one, would you say it was the same type
Yes, yes.
unexpired.
Yes, I think so, but
So it could be, is it the fact that he lived in the Royal to begin with,
yes,
he may well have, you know,
it is a
possibly.
I think that one was planted later, but I don't know.
But not by him necessarily.
No. But there isn't the same story attached to them. We know about the ones at Llanbaddock. We know about the ones at Twinbell and Cefnile,
Yeah.
but we know about this one and the one in Mulberry House that's lost. But sorry, Ken.
When was that cedar tree planted, Jonathan?
My one,
Yeah.
18. Well, he left Usk in 1857, I think. It was about 1850, 1845-50.
Well, there's photographic evidence of the tree by the British Legion, which was planted in 1900
Yeah.
when the memorial was put there.
Right. Yes.
So there's a big difference in the age.
Yes. I thought I'd established that. I couldn't remember, but I think the tree in the lawns was a larger tree, and but I don't know.
There was a cedar tree, a very fine cedar tree, cedar of Lebanon, outside Castle House,
Oh, was
outside
it?
the gorge.
Oh,
And I remember that was cut down, died, and it was cut down in the 1960s. And Rudge had a cedar wood chest made out of the James the Royal, and it's wonderful. Doesn't anything that's put in that press never has the moth.
No.
Some years ago, I think about 10 years ago, I was contacted by a woman who was a descendant of Percy B. Shelley,
Oh, really?
and she's married to a tree person. I don't know whether he was an arborologist or whether he was a tree surgeon or whatever, but certainly grows trees where they live at Newent. And she came down to us, and I showed her the tree outside your,
Yeah.
what I think of as your office, and we tried to contact you. I tried to contact you to ask if we could look around. She was eager to get a comb. So we fossed around in the garden, and we went down to Llanbaddock as well, and they didn't have time to go and look at Cefnile, but I think they came back later. And she did contact me to say that they had taken, but then I haven't heard any more from her since then. But I thought I ought to tell you, because I did intend to. I thought maybe I'm committing offence by going around over the head.
Anybody's welcome to a comb if you can find. I have collected combs and I've tried to propagate them, but I failed.
Well, yes, but I don't know. It was only a sapling that they got, and,
Yes.
but being married to who she was married to might have helped.
No, I could do with a bit.
It might be near Newent anyway, somewhere.
I just wonder how long cedar trees generally lived.
Oh, very ancient.
Yeah.
They can be. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm sure I read that recently, but I can't remember.
And I think, you know, we have to thank Edward Trelawney for planting these trees. But whatever anyone thinks about him, a brigand, you know, womanizer, he planted those trees for us to enjoy.
Yes?
So thank you, Edward Trelawney. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that was the lot.